1926. Manhattan. A wrecking ball hangs motionless against a pewter sky. Below it, stone, pink granite, carved limestone. The face of a building that took 3 years to raise and cost, in today's money, somewhere north of $400 million. The Cornelius Vanderbilt II house. 137 rooms, the largest private residence in New York City. They are about to knock it down. The foreman gives a signal. The cable goes taut, and somewhere inside that wall, carved by Italian stonemasons who came to America with centuries of accumulated technique in their hands, who learned their craft in the same tradition that built the cathedrals of Florence and the palaces of Rome, something cracks. Nobody protests. No crowd gathers. A handful of construction workers observe from the sidewalk for a moment, hands in their pockets, then turn back to their work. The newspapers will note the demolition in a few column inches, somewhere inside the front section, below the fold. The city barely notices. A building that took 3 years to construct, that consumed a fortune measured in hundreds of millions of today's dollars, that required the labor of hundreds of craftsmen working at the edge of what was technically possible, gone in weeks, hauled away as rubble, replaced by a retail store. That indifference is the real story. Because this is not the only mansion that falls, it is not the first, and it will not come close to being the last. Across the following decades, mansion after mansion will follow. On Fifth Avenue and in Newport, on Long Island's Gold Coast and in the Hudson Valley, in Philadelphia, in Chicago, in Boston, each one leaving behind a gap in the streetscape that fills quickly with something more profitable. A corner of the city that forgets within a generation what stood there. A piece of craftsmanship that no one will ever reproduce because the people who knew how to build it are gone, and the world that required it no longer exists. There will be no moment of national mourning, no congressional hearing, no preservation campaign mounted in time. The greatest collection of private architectural achievement in American history will be dismantled piece by piece across 50 years, and the country will barely notice. And then, one day, standing on a corner in Midtown Manhattan, where a department store has stood for nearly a century, someone will ask, "What used to be here?" And nobody will know. This is not a story about a house. This is a story about the end of an entire way of building, an entire way of living, an entire idea about what wealth was supposed to look like, what it owed the civilization that produced it, and what civilization owed it in return. And the question that hangs in the October air above those falling stones, the question nobody asked out loud until it was already too late, is this: what exactly did America destroy, and why did it let it happen? To understand why America built these mansions, you first have to understand what America was in 1870. There was no income tax, no estate tax, no capital gains tax, no meaningful federal regulation of business. Nothing stood between an ambitious man and whatever he could accumulate. The Industrial Revolution had detonated across the continent with a force that had no precedent in human history. Railroads stitched the country together for the first time, creating a national market where none had existed. Steel mills in Pittsburgh and oil refineries in Cleveland and coal mines in Pennsylvania and textile factories in New England ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And a small number of men, Rockefeller in oil, Carnegie in steel, Vanderbilt in railroads, Morgan in finance, Gould in speculation, Frick in coke, were capturing the explosion, not just profiting from it, controlling it, shaping it, owning it. By 1900, the top 0.1% of American families controlled roughly 25% of everything in the country. A concentration of wealth so extreme that when the economists Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zuckman finally mapped it a century later, drawing on a century of tax records, they described it as the single highest point of private wealth concentration in American recorded history. These men had more money than any private citizens had ever held in any democratic republic since the ancient world. The question was what to do with it. The answer for the Gilded Age elite was architectural. They had made their grand tours of Europe, moving through the chateaux of the Loire Valley, through the Renaissance palazzos of Florence and Rome, through the ancient country estates of the English aristocracy, through the palace galleries of Versailles and the royal gardens of Schönbrunn, and they had come home with a mission. They would build American palaces that surpassed anything the old world had managed. Not imitations, originals, bigger, more costly, more heavily staffed, more ornamental. Proof that the new money of industrial America had not merely equaled the accumulated wealth of centuries of European aristocracy, it had exceeded it. This was not mere vanity. It was a statement about American civilization itself. The philosopher Thorstein Veblen watched this happening from his academic post and published a book in 1899 called The Theory of the Leisure Class that explained it with uncomfortable precision. He called it conspicuous consumption. His argument was devastating in its simplicity. The wealthy didn't build enormous houses because they needed the space. They built them because the waste itself was the point. A 70-room summer cottage that required 50 servants to operate was more impressive precisely because no rational person needed it. The irrationality was the signal. The extravagance was the advertisement. The more obviously beyond necessity a thing was, the more clearly it demonstrated the wealth required to build and maintain it. Conspicuous consumption of valuable goods is a means of reputability. In order to be reputable, it must be wasteful. No merit would accrue from the consumption of the bare necessities of life. He was describing the breakers. He was describing Marble House. He was describing every limestone palace that lined Fifth Avenue from 50th Street to 70th Street in the display the newspapers had taken to calling Millionaires' Row. And he was writing a quiet, meticulous prophecy about how it would end. The Vanderbilts hired Richard Morris Hunt, the first American ever trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the institution that had defined European classical architecture for 2 centuries, to design their Newport summer cottage in the style of an Italian Renaissance palazzo. He had studied in the same ateliers that produced the architects of the great European palaces. He understood proportion the way a composer understands harmony, not as a set of rules to follow, but as a physical reality you either feel or you don't. They spent $11 million on Marble House alone, $7 million of that on marble alone, 500,000 cubic feet of it quarried from 3 continents, shipped to Newport, and cut to exact specifications by craftsmen who traveled from Europe for the purpose. More than $500 million in today's money. For a house the family used 10 weeks a year. The breakers, built for Cornelius Vanderbilt II and completed in 1895, had 70 rooms, 48 bedrooms, was the first private home in Rhode Island with full electricity, and sat empty for 9 months of every year, maintained by a permanent staff through the winter, heated just enough to prevent the pipes from freezing. The annual operating cost in modern equivalent dollars, somewhere between $2 and $4 million year after year, for a house that was used for a summer holiday. The mathematics were always frightening. Nobody chose to look at them. That is not a home. That is a thesis statement about who these people believed themselves to be.
And for a brief, extraordinary, morally complicated, and historically unrepeatable moment in American history, they were right.
Behind every marble hallway was a back staircase. Behind every back staircase was a story nobody photographed. The breakers required a permanent staff of roughly 40 servants year-round. During the 10-week summer season, when the Vanderbilt family arrived by private rail car, that number grew considerably larger. The household machine had to be running perfectly before the family stepped through the door, and it had to keep running perfectly until the moment they departed. Maids for each floor, footmen for each function, cooks and kitchen maids and scullery maids operating in strict hierarchies invisible to the family above. Laundresses who processed the household's washing through the day and into the night. A housekeeper who managed the female staff with the authority and the absolute requirement for obedience of a military commander. A butler who presided over the male servants in the formal rooms with equivalent authority. Coachmen, then chauffeurs as automobiles replaced horses. Gardeners who maintained the grounds, the formal garden, the kitchen garden, the approach roads, the cliff walk boundary, in the immaculate condition the family expected to find on arrival after months of absence. Electricians to tend the wiring system that was still novel enough in 1895 to require specialist knowledge that most American electricians did not have. Plumbers for the elaborate indoor pipes, the hot and cold running water in multiple bathrooms simultaneously, the innovative fixtures that were virtually unknown in rural Rhode Island. Engineers for the coal-burning boilers in the basement rooms the size of small factories that fed the central heating system through hundreds of feet of pipe to radiators in every room. Each person had a role. Each role had a uniform. Each uniform was a social statement. Veblen understood this dimension too. Servants didn't merely perform labor, they performed status. A butler in livery wasn't simply opening doors, he was evidence. Evidence that his employer was so wealthy he could afford to pay a trained professional man, a man who could read and write, who spoke properly, who managed subordinates, simply to open doors for him. The more elaborate the household staff, the more numerous their ranks, the more distinctive their liveries, the clearer the signal of wealth. The clearer the signal of wealth, the higher the social reputation. The higher the reputation, the better the marriages the family's daughters could expect. The wider the business network, the more invitations arrived, the more power accumulated. The servants were not employees in any ordinary sense, they were architecture, as deliberately arranged and as essential to the function of the display as the carved limestone walls they moved through. In 1900, there were 1.5 million domestic servants in the United States. The NBER economist George Stigler, who devoted an entire 1946 study to mapping the domestic service industry across 4 decades, found that the ratio of servants to private families stood at 94.3 per thousand, nearly 1 servant for every 10 American families in the country. The wealthy had dozens. Some of the grandest households had 100. The majority were women, more than 80% by census data. The majority of those women were immigrants, Irish and Swedish and German and Bohemian and Italian, arriving in the great waves of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They came to America and found that the economy offered them a narrow and unglamorous range of choices, the factory floor or the domestic parlor. Many chose the parlor because, despite its social stigma and its physical isolation from ordinary life, it offered something the factory floor did not: room and board, regular meals, and a degree of physical security that a factory wage, paid out and then spent on rent and food, could not match. A 1908 survey conducted by the Maine Bureau of Labor Statistics found that domestic servants earned a median income of $4 per week plus room and board, actually more in raw dollars than many factory workers of the period. And yet, the waiting lists for factory positions were consistently longer than those for domestic service, because the factory gave something the Vanderbilt parlor had never offered:
could not offer, was structurally incapable of offering. Evenings of your own. Sundays of your own. The right, when the workday ended, to go home. The right to exist as an independent person rather than a component of someone else's household. The contemporary account of Ethel M. Smith, writing in Current History magazine in 1927, captures the mood with a single devastating quote from a women's division supervisor in Michigan. "The girls prefer to do factory work and have their evenings and Sundays free." One sentence, the entire story of why the Gilded Age mansion could not survive the 20th century in it. The servants' world inside a Gilded Age mansion was organized with a precision that had to be invisible to function. Wake before dawn, light the fires before the family stirred. The family must never encounter the mechanics of their own comfort. The food must appear. The fire must be already burning when they descended. The bath must be already drawn. The silver must be already polished. The flowers must be already arranged. The illusion of effortless luxury demanded that its own infrastructure remain completely hidden. And so the servants moved through a second building that existed inside the first one. Service corridors behind the main corridors. Hidden staircases beside the grand staircases. Separate entrances, separate dining rooms, separate staircases, separate lives, running parallel to the family's life, but never allowed to intersect with it, never allowed to interrupt it, never allowed to be seen. The Biltmore Estate in North Carolina, George Vanderbilt's 175,000-square-foot chateau in the Blue Ridge Mountains, 135 rooms, the first private home in the rural American South with full electricity and central heating, sitting on 125,000 acres of what Vanderbilt was transforming into a model scientific forest, employed more than 100 people year-round. The boiler rooms in the basement were the size of small factories. Coal came in by a private rail spur that Vanderbilt had built specifically to serve the estate. Each post had a purpose. Remove one and the mechanism faltered. Remove several and the building could not function. Remove the majority and the building became simply a very large, very cold, very expensive collection of empty rooms. These people are almost entirely absent from the photographs that survive from this era. That is not an accident of documentation. It was a deliberate condition of their employment. They were the machinery. The machinery was not supposed to be visible. And so they moved through the beautiful rooms and beautiful corridors of the most beautiful private houses in America, and they left almost nothing behind. No photographs, occasionally a name in a payroll ledger, sometimes a letter home to a sister in Ireland or a mother in Bohemia. Mostly, silence. They built the world that the Gilded Age was proud of, and the Gilded Age was not proud of them. The summer season in Newport lasted 10 weeks. 10 weeks that cost more than most Americans would earn in a decade. And it was, by every account, in every letter, in every newspaper column of the period, spectacular beyond ordinary description. By the mid-1890s, Newport had become what one observer called the most concentrated display of private wealth in the history of the Western Hemisphere. Along Bellevue Avenue and the cliff walk above the Atlantic, the summer cottages of the American elite stood in a row that had no parallel anywhere in the world. Not in the English countryside, where centuries of aristocratic wealth had built fine houses but spread them across entire counties. Not in the chateau country of the Loire Valley, where the great houses were separated by miles of farmland. In Newport, they stood side by side on narrow lots, competing and complementing, each one a direct statement aimed at the neighbors on either side, each one designed to be seen from the street as much as from within. There was the Breakers, the crown jewel of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, 70 rooms of Indiana limestone and Italian marble. There was Marble House, the monument William K. Vanderbilt built for his wife Alva, a gift ostensibly, though Alva would later say it was the one thing she had that was entirely hers. There was Ochre Court, 50 rooms modeled on a French chateau, built for railroad heir Ogden Goelet in 1892. The Elms, built for coal magnate Edward Berwind in 1901, modeled on the Château d'Anières outside Paris. Château-sur-Mer, one of the earliest Newport cottages and still one of the finest examples of high Victorian architecture in America. Rosecliff, designed by Stanford White in the model of the Grand Tryon at Versailles. Beechwood, the Astor family's Newport cottage, where Mrs. Caroline Astor held court over the social world she had organized and controlled. That social world was governed by rules so intricate they required professional navigation. Mrs. Astor's social secretary, Ward McAllister, famously declared that New York had room for precisely 400 people in polite society, the number chosen because that was how many fit comfortably in Mrs. Astor's ballroom on Fifth Avenue. Everyone else, regardless of their wealth, regardless of their education, regardless of their social intentions, was outside the circle. The Astors, the Lorillards, the Belmonts, and a handful of other old money families had determined who belonged and had no intention of revising their determination. The Vanderbilts crashed this world with the aggression of people who had never been taught that they couldn't. Alva Vanderbilt, wife of William K. Vanderbilt, daughter-in-law of the Commodore's fortune, threw a costume ball in 1883 at the family's Fifth Avenue mansion that became the defining social event of the decade. She invited journalists to cover it explicitly, ensuring the coverage was extensive and detailed. She had 1,200 guests. The costumes were extraordinary, weeks of preparation, Parisian designers, historical research, competitive creativity. The cost would register in today's money in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And she arranged matters so that Mrs. Astor's daughter, who desperately wanted an invitation and whose social standing depended on being seen to be included, could not receive one until Mrs. Astor herself paid a formal social call on the Vanderbilt household. Mrs. Astor paid the call. The Vanderbilts had won. The social hierarchy of the wealthiest and most powerful city in America had been permanently reorganized by a party. It was a triumph of sheer force of ambition over inherited position, of calculated display over quiet privilege. And it was, though nobody understood it in the moment, the beginning of the end. Because the logic that made the Vanderbilts' rise possible, that wealth could buy anything, including social position, including the rewriting of social rules, was also the logic that would eventually destroy the entire world they were building. The beauty of these years was real. It was not manufactured or performed. It was designed and built by people who understood that architecture was a moral as well as an aesthetic enterprise, that the proportions of a room and the quality of its materials could communicate something true about the civilization that produced them. Stand in the breakers today, and the scale still stops you. The quality of the stone, the way the rooms move from monumental public grandeur through intermediate scales to something almost intimate in the family's private quarters, the relationship between the building and the ocean beyond it. These buildings were made to endure for centuries. But even in the golden years, the mathematics were always frightening. A modern estimate of what it costs to maintain a comparable property, specialist masonry repair, roof maintenance, climate control to protect the historic materials, 24/7 security, grounds maintenance for formal gardens and cliff walk approaches, specialized plumbing and electrical systems hidden inside walls designed for different systems entirely, runs between $6 million and $10 million per year. Against that, the family occupied the house for 10 weeks. 9 months of the year, the staff maintained an empty palace. Nobody asked the question in 1895. Nobody had to. In 1895, there was no income tax. In 1895, there was no estate tax. In 1895, the fortunes being generated by Standard Oil and Carnegie Steel and Vanderbilt railroads were still growing faster than any household could possibly spend them. The mathematics were frightening. Nobody chose to look. They were not inexhaustible. Nothing is. The end did not arrive in a single catastrophic moment. It arrived in 3 separate blows spaced across 30 years, each one precisely timed to destroy what the last one had merely weakened. Understanding how this worked, how a world that seemed so permanent could dissolve so completely and so quickly requires understanding each blow in sequence. The first blow, 1913, the tax. On February 3, 1913, the 16th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified by the required number of states and became the law of the land. For the first time in American history, the federal government had the explicit legal authority to collect a direct tax on personal income. The Gilded Age had been built in the complete and legally protected absence of this mechanism. Every dollar that Rockefeller extracted from Standard Oil, every dollar that Carnegie took from his steel mills, every dollar that Vanderbilt earned from his railroads, every dollar had been theirs entirely without the government claiming any share. That era ended on February 3, 1913. The initial rates were designed to seem modest. The wealthiest Americans, those earning above $500,000, roughly equivalent to $15 million today, paid 7%. This seemed manageable. The Newport season continued, the staffs were maintained, the limestone was pointed. Nobody panicked. Nobody understood what it would become. By 1917, with America's entry into the First World War, Congress required revenue on a scale it had never before needed, and the income tax was the mechanism. The top marginal rate climbed to 67%, by 1918 to 77% on the highest incomes. The federal estate tax arrived in 1916, reaching into inherited wealth for the first time and interrupting the mechanism by which the great fortunes had passed intact from generation to generation. The government was now claiming a substantial portion of both earned income and inherited wealth, the two channels through which the Gilded Age fortunes had accumulated and been preserved. The economists Emanuel Sayes and Gabriel Zuckman, drawing on a century of income and estate records in their landmark 1914 NEBR study, document what followed with stark numerical precision. The top 0.01% of American families, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, and their direct peers, saw their average real wealth cut in half between 1929 and 1980. Not cut by a third, not reduced by a quarter, cut in half. And then the recovery was slow. It took almost 60 years for the fortunes of the ultra-wealthy to recover to their 1929 levels. The houses those fortunes had built were long gone, demolished, converted, abandoned, forgotten, before the money came back. The study's authors write that the most likely explanation for this dramatic compression of top wealth is the policy changes of the New Deal era. Progressive income and estate taxation made it much more difficult to accumulate and pass on large fortunes. The machinery that had built the breakers had been legally disassembled. The second blow, 1917 to 1924, the servants vanished. Not all at once, gradually, then suddenly. World War I changed the American labor market with a comprehensiveness that no one had anticipated and no one had planned. The wartime economy needed workers in factories, in shipyards, in offices, in the administrative machinery that a modern industrial war required, and it pulled them from wherever they had been. Women who had spent their working lives in domestic service found that the wartime economy offered alternatives that domestic service had never provided. Higher wages, regular hours, the physical freedom of living in your own lodgings rather than your employer's house, and something harder to quantify but no less real, the dignity of employment that the broader culture treated as legitimate labor rather than personal service. When the war ended, many of those women did not return to domestic service. The experience of independence, of having evenings and Sundays that belonged to them, of living as individuals rather than as components of a household system, had permanently altered their expectations. The factory floor and the office and the telephone exchange offered something the Vanderbilt parlor structurally could not, a life of your own after the workday ended. F.O.M. Smith documented the collapse with extraordinary precision in her 1927 article, America's Domestic Servant Shortage, in Current History magazine. The total number of domestic servants in the United States had already fallen by more than 300,000 between the 1910 and 1920 censuses, dropping from 4% to 3% of the total wage-earning population. That was before the Immigration Act of 1924. The Immigration Act of 1924, which imposed strict national origin quotas on immigration and dramatically reduced the number of Europeans who could legally enter the United States, delivered the second half of the blow. The supply of European domestic servants, which had been the primary source of skilled household labor for a generation, was abruptly restricted by federal law. Immigrants classified as servants upon arrival numbered 102,478 in 1921. By 1926, after just 4 years of the new system, that number had collapsed to 30,587, a fall of more than 2/3 in 4 years. The great houses had been built for a world in which European labor was cheap, abundant, and renewable by every arriving steamship. That world ended with a congressional vote. George Stigler's NEBR data traces the longer arc. The ratio of servants per 1,000 private families, which had stood at 94.3 in 1900, fell to 60.2 by 1940, a 36% collapse over 4 decades in the fundamental labor supply that made these houses possible to operate. Without servants, a Gilded Age mansion was not a home. It was a building, a very large, very cold, very expensive building that no single family could run. The third blow, 1929 to 1945, the shame. The Great Depression of October 1929 did not destroy the Gilded Age mansions directly. The fortunes that built them had already been eroding for 16 years under the pressure of progressive taxation. What the Depression did, what it did with devastating cultural efficiency, was remove the last social justification for maintaining them. It transformed extreme visible wealth into a social achievement, into a moral failure. The groundwork for this transformation had been laid across the previous 3 decades. The Progressive Era, the years between roughly 1900 and 1920, saw a sustained and systematic attack on the legitimacy of Gilded Age wealth. Ida Tarbell's 2-year serialized investigation of Standard Oil's monopoly practices, published in McClure's magazine between 1902 and 1904, dismantled Rockefeller's public reputation with documented precision. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle in 1906 exposed the conditions in the meatpacking industry and showed the human cost of unregulated industrial capitalism. Jacob Riis had been documenting the living conditions of New York's immigrant poor since the 1880s, placing the tenements of the Lower East Side in direct visual and moral contrast with the marble cottages of Newport. Theodore Roosevelt made trust-busting a presidential platform and gave the criticism of monopoly power official governmental legitimacy. The social acceptability of building a $500 million summer cottage had already been declining before the Depression. The Depression made it toxic. When 1 in 4 Americans was unemployed, when families were losing their homes to foreclosure and lining up at soup kitchens and riding freight trains in search of work, when the human cost of the economic system that had produced the Gilded Age fortunes was visible on every street corner, the social calculus of conspicuous display became impossible. Veblen had written that conspicuous consumption required an audience willing to be impressed. The audience was no longer impressed. The audience was furious. The wealthy themselves felt it. Say's and Zuckman's data shows that during the 1930s, the synthetic saving rate of the top 1% went negative. The wealthy were spending down their capital, not adding to it. Some of this was pure economic loss, but some was social. Maintaining a palatial summer cottage in Newport while 1/3 of the country was unemployed became not merely expensive, but shameful. The Great Compression that followed World War II, the period of relatively equalized income distribution and high progressive taxation that lasted from the mid-1940s to the mid-1970s, completed the transformation. The social environment in which conspicuous display was the primary mechanism of reputation ceased to exist. The stage had gone, the audience had gone, and the players, one by one, quietly left.
There was one more killing blow, the most complete one, the one that didn't just empty the houses or make them unaffordable to maintain, the one that erased the very desire to build them. In 1933, the Nazi government in Germany forcibly closed the Bauhaus School of Art and Design in Dessau. The Bauhaus had been founded in 1919 by Walter Gropius in Weimar and had become, in 14 years, the most influential design school in the world. Its philosophy was explicitly and aggressively anti-ornamental. Clean lines, functional forms, the machine as the model for all design, the complete rejection of historical reference and decorative tradition. The Bauhaus believed that the industrial age required a new visual language, and that the visual language of the past, the carved stone, the gilded plaster, the classical proportions, the historical ornament, all of it, in Luce's framework, was evidence of a society that had not yet grown up, evidence of cultural backwardness, evidence of artistic crime. In 1932, Philip Johnson and Henry Russell Hitchcock organized an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York that officially named and legitimized the new approach, the international style. Glass curtain walls, steel frames, flat roofs, no ornamentation of any kind, no historical reference. Interchangeable aesthetics that looked identical in Manhattan and Mises' Barcelona and Le Corbusier's Marseille. Identical by design, because the international style's philosophy held that good architecture transcended place, transcended history, transcended culture. It was universal, it was modern, it was correct. This idea conquered American architecture with remarkable completeness. By the 1950s, every major American corporation was building in the international style. Every major institution, every government agency. The style that had produced the Seagram Building and Lever House and the United Nations headquarters became the default visual language of American institutional life. The Beaux-Arts tradition that had produced Grand Central Terminal, the New York Public Library, and every one of the Newport mansions was relegated in architecture schools to a historical footnote, an example of what culture had looked like before modernity arrived to correct it. The irony is almost too large to fully take in. The Nazis destroyed the Bauhaus in Germany because they considered modernism a degenerate foreign influence on German culture. The Bauhaus masters fled to America and convinced America's architectural elite that the beautiful old buildings were the degenerate ones. And America, the country whose Gilded Age had produced some of the finest classical buildings in the Western world, believed them and knocked them down. That is not a story about architecture. That is a story about the fragility of cultural value, about how quickly a civilization can be convinced to destroy what it has spent generations building.
Once the economics turned, and the culture turned, and the philosophy turned, the demolitions came quickly. In 1926, Alice Vanderbilt, widow of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, guardian of the fortune that had built the breakers and a dozen other properties, sold the family's Fifth Avenue mansion to developers. The house had 137 rooms. It had been built in 1883 by architect George Brown Post and had been described in the New York Times in 1893 as the finest private residence in America. The baronial mantelpiece, designed by the sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens, one of the finest American sculptors of his generation, was donated to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where it survives as a fragment severed from the room it was designed for. Certain other salvageable interior elements were removed and sold or donated. The rest was rubble. Today, Bergdorf Goodman stands on that corner. That transaction, mansion to department store, in the space of a year, is the entire story of Millionaire's Row compressed into a single address. The economics were simple and brutal. The land on Fifth Avenue between 50th and 80th Streets had become worth more, far more, empty than with a private mansion on it.
Commercial tenants could pay annual rents that exceeded the operating costs of a private house many times over. You owned a property worth X as a private residence and 5 or 10 times X as a commercial site. Every year you continued to maintain the house, you were effectively paying the difference in foregone revenue. The decision to sell was not difficult. The difficult decision, the one nobody made, would have been to keep the house. The demolitions followed in sequence. The Triple Palace, the complex of 3 mansions that William Henry Vanderbilt had built for himself and his daughters on Fifth Avenue between 51st and 52nd Streets, the most dominant architectural statement in the city, had its last section torn down in 1947. The Schwab Mansion at Riverside Drive and 73rd Street, modeled on a French chateau, widely regarded as among the finest private houses in the city, was demolished in 1948. The Murray Hill Mansion of J.P. Morgan's partner came down. The great houses of the Astors came down. One by one, through the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, the mansions of Fifth Avenue and the adjacent streets were replaced by hotels, office towers, and apartment buildings that bear no memory of what preceded them. In Newport, the process was slower and more agonizing. The families abandoned their summer cottages one by one across the Depression and the post-war decades. Some burned in fires whose origins were not always investigated. Some sat empty for years, then for decades, their roofs failing inch by inch, their limestone darkening, their formal gardens reverting to weeds and brambles. Some were sold to religious orders who converted them to schools and convents. Some were subdivided into apartments. Some were demolished simply because they had become too expensive to insure against the liability of their own deterioration. Britain was experiencing identical losses at an identical pace, and the British record is more precisely documented. Since 1900, more than 1,200 country houses have been demolished in England alone. In Scotland, one single demolition firm, Charles Brand of Dundee, knocked down at least 56 country houses in just 20 years between 1945 and 1965. By 1955, Britain was losing one historic country house every 5 days. America was doing the same, faster, and with, remarkably, less mourning.
There is a dimension of this loss that is almost never discussed, and it is the dimension that makes the loss permanent. The craftsmen who built these houses were gone too. The limestone carvers who could cut ornamental detail that would hold its shadow line through a century of weather. The ornamental plasterers who could execute Baroque ceiling decoration in wet plaster, freehand, without a template, reproducing by hand and eye what earlier generations had achieved in the great ceilings of Italy and France. The fresco painters, the mosaic setters, the gilders who applied gold leaf with a brush made from a single squirrel's tail in a technique that required years of training before it became reliable. The stained glass cutters who could read a cartoon by John Lafarge and translate it into colored light. The wrought iron workers who produced the elaborate gates and balconies and grills that framed these buildings. Most of these people were European immigrants who had arrived in America between roughly 1880 and 1924, carrying techniques that had been transmitted through generations, through medieval guilds, through Renaissance workshops, through the long chain of master and apprentice that had produced the built environment of the Old World. When the Immigration Act of 1924 restricted European immigration, it cut this supply permanently. The last generation of those craftsmen worked through the 1920s and 1930s, aging out of the workforce across the 1940s and 1950s. Their knowledge, specific, embodied, unrepeatable, residing in the muscle memory of hands that had been trained for years before they could produce reliable results, was not systematically recorded. American trade schools had not been designed to transmit it. American architectural culture, increasingly dominated by the modernist philosophy that this kind of ornament was backward, had no particular interest in preserving it. And so it died, quietly, person by person, as the craftsmen who held it retired and were not replaced.
Today, a serious restoration of the breakers to the standard of its original construction requires sourcing specialist craftsmen from Italy and Germany, from the same countries and the same craft traditions that produced the original workers, because the knowledge does not exist in sufficient concentration in the American workforce to support a major historic restoration. The money for such a restoration can be raised, the knowledge has to be imported. And for many specific techniques, it can no longer be replicated at all. The thread of transmission has been cut, and there is no reattaching it. The buildings fell. The money that maintained them was taxed away. The servants who ran them found better lives. The philosophy that valued them was discredited. The craftsmen who built them died without passing on their knowledge. 5 forces, 5 losses, all at roughly the same time. All irreversible.
It took a murder to wake America up. Not a literal one, but close enough. The original Pennsylvania station had been built by McKim, Mead, and White, the firm of Charles McKim, Stanford White, and William Mead, the greatest classical architects America had produced in the Beaux Arts tradition, and opened in 1910. It had 84 Doric columns in pink granite from Milford, Massachusetts. A waiting room modeled on the baths of Caracalla in Rome, 150 feet wide and 150 feet high, lit from above by massive glass and steel vaults that sent shafts of light down to the stone floor like a cathedral in permanent midday. Travertine stone from Italy that had been aging gracefully through half a century of daily use. Concourses that processed hundreds of thousands of passengers every day, commuters, travelers, soldiers, families, immigrants arriving in a new city for the first time, and that made every one of them feel, in the few minutes they spent moving through the building, that they were participating in something larger than the individual transaction of buying a train ticket. It was the finest public building in America. By 1961, the Pennsylvania Railroad was losing money. Air travel had eaten into its long-distance passenger revenue. The interstate highway system had eaten into its short-distance traffic. The enormous, expensive-to-maintain terminal was a financial burden. The railroad's management decided to monetize the only asset the building offered that was growing in value, the air rights above it. In 1962, they sold those rights to a developer for $50 million, with the agreement that the existing station would be demolished and replaced with a new underground facility. Above it would rise the new Madison Square Garden Arena. On October 28, 1963, demolition began. The architectural historian Vincent Scully, one of the most respected voices in American architecture, wrote what became the era's defining epitaph for the building. One entered the city like a god, one scuttles in now like a rat. It is one of the great sentences in American architectural criticism, and it captures something that all the statistics about square footage and column counts cannot. The difference between a building designed to make you feel the dignity of public life and a building designed to process you. The New York Times editorial board responded to the demolition with barely controlled fury. Any city gets what it admires, will pay for, and ultimately deserves. We will probably be judged not by the monuments we build, but by those we have destroyed. This sentence has been quoted for 60 years. It has not stopped being true. The architecture critic Ada Louise Huxtable had been documenting the systematic demolition of American architectural heritage for years, writing about it in the Times with a precision and passion that had generated critical respect and almost no practical result. She called the destruction of Penn Station a failure of civic values, the triumph of what she named tin horn culture over beauty, over history, over the obligation a civilization owes to the best things it has made. She had warned this was coming. She had written about it explicitly. Nobody had listened until the columns began to fall. The 22 bronze eagles that had decorated the station's facade were thrown into a swamp in New Jersey. The 84 Doric columns were hauled away and used as fill material in the meadowlands. The travertine stone was rubble. The glass vaults were gone. 3 years of demolition, 1963 to 1966, erased what had taken years to build and could never be rebuilt,
not because the money was unavailable, but because the craftsmen who knew how to build it in 1910 were gone, and no one had thought it worth learning how they had done it. This time, finally, the outrage changed the law. In April 1965, Mayor Wagner signed the New York City Landmarks Preservation Law. The Landmarks Preservation Commission was created with the legal authority to designate buildings as landmarks and, critically, to require owners to obtain permission before demolishing or significantly altering them. For the first time in American history, the law formally recognized that certain buildings held a public value that superseded the private property rights of their owners. The right of a landlord to demolish his own building had always been absolute. Penn Station ended that. Grand Central Terminal was saved. The New York Public Library was saved. The Villard houses were saved. The buildings that survived long enough for America to change its mind, they were saved. Penn Station was already rubble. The Vanderbilt Mansion was already Bergdorf Goodman. Most of Millionaire's Row was already gone. But some things were saved, because someone finally paid attention. 50 years too late, but not too late for everything.
They are still there. Some of them. The Breakers still stands on Ochre Point Road in Newport, Rhode Island, managed by the Preservation Society of Newport County, open to the public more than 500,000 times every year. Its 70 rooms remain furnished as they were in the Vanderbilt era. You can walk through the room where Cornelius Vanderbilt II slept. You can stand in the loggia and watch the same Atlantic his family watched in the summer of 1895. The conservation work that keeps it standing represents decades of dedicated labor by people who understood what it would cost the world if they stopped. The building is magnificent. It deserves to survive. What you cannot do is live there. The Breakers now operates as what its builders would have called a museum, a word that would have been incomprehensible and probably horrifying to Cornelius Vanderbilt II. He built this house as a declaration of private power. The idea that it would one day be managed by a non-profit preservation organization, maintained partly on ticket revenue, open to strangers for $34 per adult admission, would have been a vision of failure to him. The building survived. The world it was built to express, private, powerful, self-justifying, beyond the reach of ordinary social reckoning, did not. The house outlasted its purpose. What we have preserved is the body, the life left long ago. Biltmore in Asheville, North Carolina, found a different path to survival. George Vanderbilt's widow, Edith, opened the estate to paying visitors in 1930, during the Depression, when private maintenance had become financially impossible for a single family even of considerable means. It was one of the first great American houses to embrace tourism as a survival strategy. The bet paid off. Today, Biltmore is the most visited historic house in the United States, welcoming over 1 million visitors per year, operating a winery and multiple restaurants and a hotel on the property, employing hundreds of people in the tourist economy of western North Carolina. George Vanderbilt never imagined any of this, but his house is alive in a way that most of his peers' houses are not. The dream survived. It learned to sell itself to survive. Marble House and the Elms and Ochre Court and several of the other Newport survivors are managed by the Preservation Society, open to the public, maintained through a combination of ticket revenue, donations, and the dedicated attention of people who have decided that these buildings deserve to exist. The decision was not obvious. During the 1950s and 1960s, several of the Newport cottages came genuinely close to demolition. The decision to save them was made by individuals, not by governments, by private people who cared enough to act before it was too late. And then there are the ones that didn't make it. Linwood Hall in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania.
The 110-room neoclassical palace built for streetcar magnate Peter Widener at the turn of the century, called at its completion the last American Versailles, its art collection of old masters and impressionists, once rivaling the great European museum collections before it was dispersed at auction, sat empty for decades. Its roof was failing. Its rooms were deteriorating behind closed doors. It was purchased in 2023 by the Linwood Hall Preservation Foundation, and restoration has begun. Whether it will be saved completely or partly depends on decisions and resources that are not yet fully committed. It is, at this moment, balanced. Whitemarsh Hall in Whitemoor, Pennsylvania, the 147-room estate of banker and socialite Edward Stotesbury, with a ballroom that could hold 1,000 guests and a household staff that numbered in the dozens, was demolished in the 1980s. Not the Depression era, not the post-war period, the 1980s. 90 years of existence, including years of increasing deterioration and neglect, and then rubble in a matter of weeks. Every building you can visit today survived because someone refused to let it die. Every building that is gone was abandoned by everyone who could have saved it.
Billionaires still exist. They always will. So why don't they build like this anymore? The answer is not money. Sayez and Zuckman's research shows the top 0.1% of American families controlled 22% of total household wealth in 2012, matching the 1929 Gilded Age peak almost exactly. The top 0.01%, approximately 16,000 families with net assets above $110 million, controlled 11.2% of everything in the country. In 2012, the average real wealth of those top 0.01% families had fully recovered to its 1929 levels and was growing at 7.9% per year. The Gilded Age wealth is back. The mansions are not. What doesn't exist is everything else that made the mansions possible, and not one of those things is coming back. The craftsmen are gone. The specific, embodied, handed-down knowledge required to carve ornamental limestone, to execute Baroque plaster ornamentation freehand, to lay complex mosaic floors, to set stained glass in the manner of a Gilded Age commission, this knowledge was held by a small, specific, and irreplaceable population of European immigrant craftsmen. When immigration was restricted in 1924, the supply of new knowledge carriers ended. The existing craftsmen aged through the 1930s and 1940s and retired in the 1950s. Their knowledge was not systematically recorded. It was not taught in American trade schools. It died with them, person by person, across 2 decades. Today, a serious restoration of a major Gilded Age interior requires sourcing specialists from Europe, from Italy and Germany and France, because the knowledge does not exist in sufficient concentration in the American workforce. For many specific applications, it cannot be replicated at any price. A stonemason can cut stone. Learning to cut stone the way the craftsmen of 1895 cut it, with the specific tradition of European guild training behind them, with the specific understanding of how carved profiles weather over centuries, requires a chain of transmission that has been broken. You cannot reconnect it simply by paying more money. You need the people, and the people are gone. The social incentive has reversed. Veblen's conspicuous consumption required an audience willing to be impressed by visible extravagance. The Gilded Age had that audience, a press fascinated by the Newport season, a public that read about the Vanderbilt balls with something between envy and admiration, a social system in which display was the primary mechanism of reputation. After a century of progressive backlash, Depression-era shame, modernist critique, in the sustained cultural delegitimization of conspicuous wealth, that audience is gone. The ultra-wealthy today practice what social observers have come to call stealth wealth.
expensive things that look inexpensive to everyone who isn't already initiated into the codes of the ultra-expensive, the luxury that requires no explanation, the status signal that is invisible to anyone who doesn't already know what to look for. The billionaire in a plain gray t-shirt is not practicing false modesty. He is practicing a very sophisticated form of conspicuous consumption. The absence of display is the display. The deliberate refusal of ostentation is the ostentation. A 137-room limestone palace on Fifth Avenue with 50 servants in livery and a private ballroom and a porte-cochere wide enough for 4 carriages. This is the opposite of stealth. It cannot be done quietly. It cannot be done with any degree of the studied casualness that contemporary elite culture demands of its members. And the ultra-wealthy today have understood very clearly that being seen is a risk and not a reward. The architectural culture was destroyed. The architects who know how to design in the Beaux-Arts tradition are a small and professionally marginal minority within a profession that spent 3 full generations, from roughly 1938 to the present, training students in systematic hostility to that visual language. The students at Harvard Architecture in 1950 were taught explicitly and philosophically that classical ornament was backward. Their students were taught the same. Their students were taught the same. The result is a profession that still, in most of its elite institutions, treats classical design as either a historical curiosity or a retrograde political statement. There is a small classical revival underway, the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art, New Classicism, a growing movement of architects and academics arguing that beauty was discarded too hastily in the 20th century and that there is no philosophical reason why contemporary buildings cannot incorporate historical reference and ornament. The movement has produced genuinely beautiful work, but it swims against the current of a profession, a critical establishment, and a system of academic education that remains deeply committed to the modernist inheritance of Gropius and Mies and Luce. It will be decades, if ever, before the classical tradition is taught in American architecture schools with the seriousness it deserves. The conditions that produced the breakers are gone. All of them, simultaneously, within a single century. The financial conditions, the labor conditions, the craft conditions, the cultural conditions, the philosophical conditions, and most of them left without anyone noticing until they were already gone.
Here is what we know. The Gilded Age mansions were built by a very small number of people who had captured an extraordinary and entirely unrepeatable combination of circumstances: zero taxation on income and inheritance, unlimited cheap immigrant labor from the servant classes of Europe, abundant skilled craftsmen carrying centuries of European building tradition, and a social environment that rewarded the most extravagant possible display of private wealth as the primary mechanism of social reputation. Those 4 conditions coexisted in America for approximately 40 years, from the end of the Civil War to the ratification of the 16th Amendment in 1913. Not one of those conditions survived the 20th century intact. What they left behind, the buildings themselves, required all 4 conditions to survive. Without servants, they could not be operated. Without protected fortunes, they could not be maintained. Without craftsmen, they could not be restored when age and weather and use took their toll. And without a cultural environment that valued their existence enough to protect them legally and fight for them publicly, they could not survive the economic logic that said, "Tear it down, the land is worth more empty." And so they fell, one by one, across half a century, almost entirely unnoticed until the process was complete. The Pennsylvania Station demolition of 1963 was the moment America finally woke up. The outcry was genuine, sustained, and productive.
It produced the Landmarks Preservation Law that saved Grand Central, the Villard houses, and dozens of other buildings that had survived long enough for the culture to change its mind. But Penn Station was a public building. It belonged to everyone in the way private mansions did not. The mansions were private. Their owners could do what they wished with them, and what they wished, one by one, was to be free of them. The buildings were not destroyed by enemies. They were abandoned by the people who owned them, as the economic and social and cultural justifications for maintaining them collapsed simultaneously. Every building you can visit today survived because someone refused to let it die. The Preservation Society of Newport County was founded in 1945 specifically to save what remained of the Newport cottages. The people who organized it understood that without active intervention, the houses would continue falling. They were not wrong. They saved the Breakers, Marble House, the Elms, and several others. They did not save everything. Nobody could have saved everything. But they saved what they could, and what they saved is extraordinary. The Vanderbilt Mansion stood for 43 years. Bergdorf Goodman has stood on that corner for nearly a century now. The building that replaced the finest private residence in America is a department store. It is a very fine department store, but it is a department store. And here is the question that the ruins leave behind. Not, should we build like this again? That question answers itself. Not, was the Gilded Age morally justified? That question has a complicated answer. Not, were the Vanderbilts admirable or monstrous? That is the wrong question to ask about history. Every civilization builds monuments to what it believes in. The Romans built aqueducts and amphitheaters and roads that lasted 2,000 years. The medieval Europeans built cathedrals, some of which took 3 centuries to complete, built by people who knew they would never see the finished building, who built anyway because they believed the work was worth doing. The Gilded Age built palaces, monuments to private accumulations so enormous that individual human beings had more visible power, more physical consequence, more lasting mark on the landscape than any private citizen had ever possessed. What do we build? What are we building right now, today, that will still be standing in 130 years and tell the people of 2155 what we believed in, what we valued, what we thought was worth building to last? And when it is gone, when the last limestone palace has been absorbed by the city that forgot it, when the last carved capital has been hauled away as rubble, when the corner where the Breakers stood has been filled with something more profitable, what will remain to tell the story of what we were? The stone remembers, for a while, long enough if we are paying attention. The question is whether we are.